I head down.
Right.
And,
right.
Take pictures.
So I see Nick's got us on YouTube. And let's see, what is this? Okay. I am going to, oh yes. Hey, Mark, nice to see you. Mark Arminsky's here. I'm going to do a few very brief intros. My name is Ben Marks, and I'm one of the members of the board of TRPS, and I'm also a writer and editor at Collectors Weekly. And today we're broadcasting from the spacious studio of pattycakesyarn.com. So that's why there's all the sewing stuff behind me, as well as a few Seattle, well-placed Seattle pieces. One of yours, Scott, and also a chantry, of course. And I just want to welcome everybody. We're chatting today with Scott McDougall, who is somebody who I could have known when I lived in Seattle, because we were living there at the same time, but we actually never met until I had moved away from Seattle, right?
Yeah, that's the way I remember it.
Yeah. And Scott is a rock poster artist, of course. If you've purchased a copy of some of the road trip CDs, the Grateful Dead road trip CDs, then you've seen his work. You've probably seen his work if you've subscribed to the Rocket magazine back in the 80s, I guess. Yeah.
80s and 90s.
And into the 90s, yeah. And then in 2015, Scott did a book called Split Fountain Hieroglyphics, which I have a copy, my copy is right here, actually. And it's signed by a couple of people. And this was an edition of what, 500? 500,
yeah.
Okay. So before we get into talking with Scott, I just wanted to mention that, TRPS, obviously we're not doing shows this year for obvious reasons because of COVID. And that's been a big hole in the hearts of everybody who loves rock posters and loves seeing things live and meeting people and meeting artists and getting their stuff signed and all that good stuff. This is our third webinar that we're doing on Zoom. And we have a couple more lined up to go, maybe one in December we're hoping to do, and we should have an announcement about that soon. In the meantime, I would encourage you to continue to be a member of the Rock Poster Society. In the last 12 months, and this was even before COVID, we gave away around $20,000 to artists who we heard needed a helping hand. And then once COVID happened and gig posters went away, the funds we dispersed were even more important to a lot of people. So even though we're not doing shows, which is how we raise money for our Artist Relief Trust through the receipts at the door and the sale of the Artist Relief Trust poster, we very much need your help to be a member. It's only $30. You get a free t-shirt and other goodies. So it's a good deal, and it allows us to keep giving money away to rock poster artists who need it. So there's the plug. I appreciate your indulgence listening to it. So I want to dive right in here, Scott. I'm going to go to, if it's okay, I'm going to go to a little slideshow that I've prepared, and then we can talk in the background
Sure.
while the slides go. Is that okay with you?
Sounds fine.
Okay, so this might take me just 2 seconds to figure out, and so is everyone seeing a cast of thousands right now?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, good. So So this is what year is this from?
I think it's 1970 or 71.
Yeah, and this had, I always thought this had kind of a early Family Dog look to it. I guess because of the cutout of the guy. Was that on your mind at all?
This was really influenced by Murphy comic book strips and George Hunter.
Okay.
And this was my sophomore year in high school, and I was just discovered offset lithography. And up to that point, I had done everything screen printed. In junior high, I was a screen printer, and only did a few jobs. But
wait a minute! In junior high, you were screen printing.
Yeah. It's how you learn. And I 8th grade shop class, I made a screen or silk screen, and having the fortunate having a brother, an older brother that was 5 years older, who was into all of the things that I wanted to get into, really set me on my way. So I saw the first stuff when I was 12 in 1966, saw the posters and started collecting immediately. And I knew what I was going to be when I grew up. Just so happens that things changed, and there weren't any psychedelic posters going on by the time I got a few chops down. So
right,
I had to come in a little later.
Right, and so this was up. You were living up on the Northern California coast.
No, this was Fresno.
Oh, Fresno. Okay.
I moved to Fresno in 1969, Labor Day weekend. Went from Eureka to Fresno, and it was in high school in Fresno that I started getting more and more jobs of doing concert posters.
Right.
Did it all the way through high school.
Living up on the Northern California coast.
No, this was Fresno.
Oh, yeah. Fresno. Okay.
Yeah. And I started collaborating with a guy who was a sophomore when I was a senior, and we ended up starting a business sort of to get him out of high school for half a day. And I was his teacher, and this was when I was 19 and he was 16. And we started collaborating more and more, and opened up a studio for 3 years.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But this
okay.
was high school.
And did you see these bands?
Oh yeah, I went to all this stuff.
Yeah.
And before I'd gone to Fresno, I'd seen pretty much all the shows that came to Eureka and Humboldt State up to 1969.
Right. And this next one, now we're back up on the North Coast here.
Yeah. This was something, my education was all in offset lithography. I started taking offset lithography in high school, and then in junior college. And so I was really interested in lithography. And so I moved to Crescent City in 75. I got a job at the printing company and started drawing stuff there and also printing there. And I did, this one was in offset, but I also printed a lot in letterpress. So I was into all of that stuff in the 70s.
Right. Yeah, and you know, it. What were some of your influences in this particular one? It looks like underground comics to me.
Bob Zoll was the influence on this one.
Bob Zoll, yeah.
And I just was a sponge, and I looked at everybody's work from 66 on, and just every year there'd be more and more people, and especially in the poster stuff. San Francisco just kept cranking them out after 67 and 68 and 69, and all these artists came, and it's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
To be a collector back then. And even when I was in junior high school, I worked at a printing company in Eureka on weekends and swept up lead shavings and threw paper away. And they were about 2 blocks from a import store that carried Family Dog and Berkeley Bonaparte posters by 1967.
Right.
So I was hooked. That's where my money went. And I was a collector.
Now, you told me one time about your encounter with some of the family dog people.
Yeah, I had an opportunity when I was living in Eureka. My next door neighbor was a realtor, and this is when I was in elementary and junior high school. And in 1967, probably the fall or winter, the family dog panel truck was parked next door to our house. And I already knew what it was, and just had to go over and check it out. And it was Luria Castell was driving it, and she was already looking for rural property in southern Humboldt.
Now, how did you know? How did you know it was the family dog truck?
It sat right on the side, and I knew what it was. I was already a poster collector, and
Right.
and I already knew who Stanley Mouse was and Rick Griffin and Moscoso, and they had, the three of them, I think, had done the painting. Mouse did the sides, and Griffin had painted a large poppy flower along the whole roof. And the inside was papered with handbills. All early stuff was all thin paper. And if you're a poster nerd, you know that that's all 66 stuff. And she gave the guy who his father was the realtor, and I handbills from inside. They're all just taped under the ceiling. And I recalled I got number 14 Zigzag was my handbill for the day, and held
Nice.
on to it for a long time.
Well, let's move on here.
Sure.
Now we're in Seattle, I think. Yeah.
And I moved to Seattle in 1980, and it was not to do rock posters, but it was just to do illustration, and had no idea what I was getting into. I thought being a sign painter and a little bit of a poster artist would be all I needed to know to become an illustrator in advertising or something. And I'd been working with airbrush since probably the 8th grade, and went up there and met some art directors, which I'd never worked with an art director before, and started working for design studios. And Wilkinson Peterson, Warren and Tom are these two guys I met who were just really interesting designers and taught me just tons about things like doing sketches and tissues before you dive into the final art when you get a job, those kinds of things. And they were really great at keeping me paying attention to what I need to know to be an illustrator.
Right.
And I was almost exclusively airbrushed then, and did that for, I don't know, another 30 years. And so this poster was a opportunity I had in 1986 or 87 to do a psychedelic poster for a printing company in Seattle. And it was an old German printer, and he didn't know anything about this stuff. And when he saw it in black and white, he said, "Oh, well, I'll be able to read it when it's in color." And I said, "Yeah, right." He hated it. And but I loved it.
Why did he want a psychedelic poster?
You know, it was someone in their sales department thought it'd be a great promo giveaway in the middle of, 25 or 20 years after the fact.
Right.
And so I did something that was as typical looking as psychedelic as I could. And from then, I think I got the job doing a rocket cover, or vice versa. And it was another kind of psychedelic piece, which I think you've got a picture of, yeah. And that opened a few doors as well.
Right. And so this is, this was an art. This was to illustrate the cover for an article about the 60s scene, which your book details quite a bit.
Yeah, it was mostly about Sky River Festival, and I was using, I think, a black trap line for everything, because I wasn't sure if we could print, using black as a color. So this was one way I knew that we could get it right, and not having worked with this. This was my first job with the rocket, and I ended up doing a couple of covers, I think. But this was another one in the vein of Wes Wilson, who was big influence on me early on, but I kind of didn't use any of that look until the 80s. So I
Right.
wasn't doing stuff like this in the 70s so much.
Right. Did doing this cover for basically an article about Sky River, which was 68, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did that, were you already interested in those moments in Seattle's rock and rock art history, or was this sort of experience kind of a catalyst or to reinforce your interest?
Well, it was reinforcement. When I moved to Seattle, I met Milo Johnson and Doug Fast probably in 1980, and they were the first two people I'd ever met in my life that also collected posters. And they had some Seattle stuff, and so that was my introduction to that. So that would have been in 1980, and then I met a couple of other guys who were friends with each other and did light shows. They were trying to revive psychedelic light shows in Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
And they were friends with Don Paulson, who was friends with Matthew Cates. And so I got to see all of those posters around 1980, 81, 82.
Yeah.
So I got a pretty early introduction to that stuff too.
Yeah.
And,
we'll get to the San Francisco Sound stuff in just a minute. Yeah. Well, what was your impression of the poster scene as a collecting scene in Seattle in the 80s versus San Francisco? I mean, did it seem like, oh yeah, this is just the same thing happening up here, or were there differences that struck you?
Well, I think the main difference for me was that none of this stuff was ever for sale in Seattle. So the print runs, instead of being like 10,000, 20,000, were probably more like 200. And so they were hard to find. And in San Francisco, even as late as 1970, you could still buy a lot of stuff if you would search out Ben Friedman, who had most everything in San Francisco, everything related. So if you had the money, you could go buy everything. But in Seattle, it was a different thing. You couldn't buy anything. And I just mostly found everything through buying collections of, I can remember a clothing store downtown that had maybe 20 Fillmore posters up and shrink wrapped, and one of them was the BG-74. And they had bought it at a garage sale. And stuff like that was easy to do in Seattle in the 80s because there wasn't much of a collector, scene at all.
Right.
So.
Meanwhile, the Seattle stuff was difficult to collect because there was just simply so little of it. Yeah,
you had to kind of be in tune with some pickers, secondhand pickers, and I found a couple of early John Moran collections that way, just through vintage toy stores and record collectors. And there were a few record dealers in Seattle who also collected posters, so it kind of went hand in hand.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you also did a number of illustrations in the 90s for Wes Wilson for the shows that predate the TRPS shows. This one's actually behind me that I have. How did Wes Wilson know to reach out to you? How did that all come about?
I was trying to remember that, and I think Art Chantry may have given me the first issue of Off the Wall. And I think that was like 91. And I think I sent Wes some samples of my work at that time. And then he wrote back to me, and for this, I think maybe it was in 93 or 92, he may have asked me, but I didn't do anything in 92. In 93, I went ahead and did this poster. I'd never had to have anything printed myself. Being an illustrator, you just turn it over to someone else and they take care of all that. And so I had this poster screen printed, and Raphael Schnepf and Gary Houston, both in Portland, and the three of us rented a table together because we didn't have enough stuff to really fill out like a booth.
Right.
And, it was, Gary was just starting out, and Schnepf had things from all kinds of different things that he'd done all the way back to the 60s. And I was dealing in posters a lot in the early 90s. So I brought stuff from Seattle down to San Francisco, but most of it was San Francisco stuff I bought up in Seattle. And came down there to San Francisco for a couple of years. And it was really fun because in the early days, there really weren't very many artists, not like it is now. And so you got to meet all your heroes, and a lot of stuff was for sale. And so everybody went down there with a bunch of cash and a bunch of posters, and everybody came back with a bunch of posters and a bunch of cash because you would sell stuff and trade stuff. And it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. And then this is 94.
Yeah. And Gary Houston screen printed these for me.
Oh, okay.
In Portland. And he did the next one too. And this was my favorite poster. And then this one was it was canceled. And I found out it was canceled, I think, on about the third color we were printing. Or Gary was printing. So I went ahead and had them finished. And as you can probably guess, I still got a few of these.
Yeah.
As the show was canceled. And that's your big opportunity to sell the poster, is at the show.
Right.
And after that, it's, one every 5 years or so.
Right. Well, that sort of brings us to your book, which was beautifully designed by Glenn Beebe. And you've mentioned Art Chantry, who's one of whose posters is right up there. And Art wrote a foreword to this. And I may have had something to do with the book too. I can't remember.
Yeah. Well, we need to back up a little bit because when The Art of Rock came out, I think Dennis King and Paul Grushkin, no, not Dennis King, Paul Grushkin approached Art Chantry about, hey, what's going on up in Seattle, or what went on in Seattle up until the present day, which was what, 80s, 88 or 87, 86, I'm not sure. And Art started photographing all the stuff that he had, and I was photographing my stuff, and we talked about it, that some pieces were printed in The Art of Rock, but there was a lot more. And from that day on, probably 25, 30 years ago, we started talking about doing a book on Seattle posters and Seattle poster artists. And it just sat around, and we kept photographing things, but by the time we got to it, 35 millimeter slides that were out of square and things, were not all that great. So we had to try to find samples again. So I went through everybody's collection that I knew of in Seattle and rephotographed everything. And other people that had collections in other places that I contacted, like Paul Getchell, and another guy in New York had pieces that I had never come across in Seattle. And they photographed them and sent them to me. And so Glenn took this huge task of sorting all this stuff out, and then also trying to make the best of some poor photography from my end of it. And, we just started putting it together on Glenn's computer, and he just, I don't know how many hours he put into this, but a lot.
Yeah.
And then I think you came along and said, well, you need an editor. And I couldn't have agreed more, especially to find an editor who would do it and trade for old 60s posters.
Right.
And man, that made me happy.
Yeah, it was a cheap date.
Yeah. So, after, I think it took about a year and a half or so from when I really decided to get serious till it came out. And that included a Kickstarter fundraiser, which was the worst part of it, but it worked out great because it was actually got the book, off the ground.
Right.
And, my original idea was to print it in Seattle with a printer that I knew because he had printed many posters for me. And we just couldn't find any way to make it work except for maybe a second mortgage and printing 20,000 of these, which I'm glad I didn't.
Yeah.
You know, there's some real enthusiastic poster collectors and around, but there's not that many. And
Yeah.
And now, after all of these years, since the release party where we all got together in Seattle and released the book, and after it was published, that was the end of my trying to promote it. I just stuck it on my website, and that's been 4 years, and that's my style of promotion. I'm really good at getting the job done, but boy, I'll let the ball drop as soon as it's printed.
Right.
I'm ready for something else.
But what's interesting to me is that after the book came out, we actually learned more about, in particular, in two artists in particular, John Mooring and Donna Wallace Cohen.
Yes.
Who was Wallace Studio and did all the stuff for Matthew Cates, whose name you mentioned earlier. And so it's kind of interesting to me that big chunks of the story, the book became kind of the thing that kicked that around.
Yeah, I think that I recall that you found John Mooring after I had sent all these letters out to all the John Moorings I could find addresses to, because when I had met him at Milo Johnson's book release party in the early 90s, he was living on Bainbridge Island, and I talked to him and then never talked to him again, but I was mostly then interested in how he had done his posters, because he had some techniques that I'd never seen used before by anyone.
Yeah.
And then he turns up in Texas, I believe.
Yeah.
And flies out for the book release party. And man, that was the icing on the cake.
Yeah. And, yeah. Well, let's look at some of the posters that are in Split Fountain Hieroglyphics. And this is not everything. This is not everything, of course. But we're going to begin with Gary Eagle. And Gary Eagle, as I understand it, had a studio, or shared a graphic design studio with Larry Van Over, who did the Piano Drop, which was the Country Joe and the Fish concert where a helicopter dropped a piano out of the sky just to do it. and then that led to Sky River a handful of months later, which some people say was the model for Woodstock.
Yeah.
Like a solid year before.
Yeah.
And the Piano Drop was a pretty interesting event in itself. And I guess it was kind of a dud. But I think the gathering of all of these people to hear some live music and see something that was pretty outrageous, I think was the impetus for Sky River. And it was probably another wet weekend in Seattle.
Right.
For the Sultan, and a lot of bands showed up there, and it was for someone like the Helix to put this on. Talk about a loose knit operation.
So for people who don't know, the Helix was a underground alternative newspaper, weekly, I guess, that Paul Dorpat ran. And promoted the Sky River. This piece, before we leave it, Gary told me that this was, he thought it was 66, but I think it was 67. And Gary Eagle worked at the Helix doing, eventually, not when this was created, but like the following year, he was working at the Helix along with Walt Crowley and folks like that. And he described himself to me as an accidental rock poster artist. He didn't get it. It seemed like he was one of several Seattle artists who really didn't aspire to be rock poster artists. It just kind of happened.
Yeah, and you have to remember that the rock poster art back then lasted about maybe 2 years.
Mhm.
And all of these people that had, kind of graphic leanings had to find something else to do. And this was what was going on then. And, but it was gone pretty quick. And all of these people kept being artists, or most of them did, and just
Yeah.
ventured off into different things. And yeah, I think this is 67.
Right.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And then this next piece, this ran in the Helix, I believe, and it was to advertise the Be-In up on Capitol Hill and Volunteer Park. And the way he described it to me was that he was told on Monday that this was happening on the weekend, or maybe not even Monday. And
there was also this, a lot of times in the Helix when they came up with an image, and I think this is a pretty great image, would print it from the same plates on a soft vellum paper as a poster.
mm-hmm.
And I don't know if the Helix sold them. They may have sold them or just given them away, probably sold them. And so there would be a poster of this, and just like the Sky River posters, which were also Helix covers.
Yeah.
Available in both ways, but they were just all from the same plate and generally the same color schemes, probably printed at the same time.
Yeah.
It was all sheepshead stuff in the early days anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then and then Gary told me that he had quite a bit of material from this time, and then his house burned down. And so you've got scarce stuff to begin with, and then it gets even scarcer.
Yeah, yeah. I think the biggest batch of Seattle things that I ever found at once might have been 20 or 25 posters that had never been posted, that came from an antique dealer on Capitol Hill who had bought them in Bellingham. And they were, some of John Moyne's best, and there was about 3 or 4 of each one that there was there. The Frank Zappa Mothers and the Janis Joplin Big Brother poster. And I'd never seen anything, a quantity of anything, and I never saw them again. And that probably was in 1988 or 89. So this stuff has always been, everybody had 2 or 3 or 5 posters, but you never saw a collection of 100 of anything.
Right.
Back then.
And here's one more Gary Eagle from Eastern Washington, Spokane, piece that he did.
Yeah, it was interesting also that Easy Chair was, I think, morphed from Blues Interchange, which was a Seattle band, and Jeff Simmons was a member of this. And at a concert with the Mothers, he jumped ship and joined Frank Zappa's band. And Frank also produced his only solo album, or his first solo album, in probably 70 or 71 maybe.
Yeah.
This is a great poster.
Oh yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Here's I mentioned Walt Crowley earlier, and this is the Sky River post. I can't remember. Is this the poster, or was this the insert in the Helix that ran?
This is the poster, and it wasn't even an insert. It was a wraparound cover.
Okay.
And it was just, the seam was right down the middle.
Yeah.
Of the poster, and Walt did a ton of illustration and a lot of lettering, and I really regret that I was never ever able to interview him. I met him a number of times. He lived in my neighborhood, and he let me photograph posters that he had, because he had the original art to a lot of his posters. He held on to his stuff, and but I didn't get to interview him at all.
Yeah,
but he was definitely, I think of as more of a cartoonist who added lettering to his stuff. And he went down to San Francisco early on and showed his work around, and wasn't able to get anyone interested in his work. as an illustrator. And so he came back up to Seattle, I believe, and went there to become a news journalist and artist, and did a lot of stuff in Seattle.
Yeah. And this is the show at Betty Nelson's raspberry farm, where the dead showed up on the last day. So they're not even on the poster. They just decided to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that it was also like a Woodstock thing. There was a rainy day, and some of the photography I've seen there, it looks pretty sloppy and a pretty small crowd, but it was definitely a camping excursion.
Right. Right. But you've got Muddy Waters on the bill. I'm noticing Richard Pryor is on the bill.
Yeah. Yeah. And if everyone showed up, I'm not sure. I doubt it. But I've seen earlier posters for this where there's numerous different bands that weren't on this one. And I believe this was probably the last one that came out where everybody is listed on this, but I don't know how many. I wasn't there.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's another Walt Crowley. Again, Easy Chair has been on the last two posters, and now we've got shows that are happening at the Eagles Auditorium in Seattle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this poster, I've only seen the real one once. I've seen at least one fake one. And this was also I believe, a back cover to the Helix.
Right.
Which looks just like this.
Mm-hmm. And Walt called his company the Shoddy Art Company.
Yeah, and he signed some of his posters that way, and I think it was one of those things that he used, like I used Come Get It Graphics for my name in the 70s.
Right.
While in Fresno.
Yeah. Yeah. And here's another one. Is this also at the Eagles? I can't. Yeah.
This is an earlier one. I believe I saw the black and white artwork for this. It was framed in Walt's living room. The one time I was in his house on Greenwood, or I guess it would be Greenwood. Yeah.
Yeah. And so typically, like an act from out of town, in this case, the Yardbirds, would come in, and then it would be a couple of local bands playing along with them.
Until a little bit later on, they started getting more and more kind of like a Fillmore lineup. I think the bands were on a tour schedule, and they probably would Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
Were the three that they probably most of these bands played those three places, and then maybe Spokane and Eugene, and
so like a Northwest circuit. Maybe Vancouver, as you say.
Yeah, I think when the Yardbirds played here, Jeff Simmons told me that when he was in Easy Chair, they took a bus trip over to Spokane, and Jimmy Page had told him that when they got back to England, he was going to quit this music stuff, and he hated bus tours and was going to go to art school. And I think something else happened along the way, and it never happened. But that was another one of Jeff Simmons. He's got a lot of stories.
I bet. Now, Walt was we've mentioned this. We've mentioned John Moring a couple of times, and Walt and John were actually really good friends for a while, roommates for a while.
Yes.
And the first piece that John did was, I believe, was a collaboration with Walt. This one.
I'm not. I would think that his first one might have been the Trips Festival.
That's right. Yeah.
And that was the first, but this is another really early one, and another split fountain piece.
Yeah. And what I wonder what the printers thought of this stuff that started coming their way.
A job, I think, is what printers thought, and I think that the printers, the splitting of the fountains, dumping in more than one color of ink in the fountain was such a great trick, because you could get a job done for the price of a one color printing, and you'd really have 2 or 3 colors in there. And, in the beginning of the press run, it would be pretty nice. And by the end of it, it may have spread out so far that the split fountain effect may have been moot.
Right.
This would have probably turned into a blue-green all over eventually.
Yeah. Yeah, to my eye, this feels more like Walt than it does John, but
that's John's lettering for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
What else you got?
What else do I got? I've got now this is John. This is a John Mowring when he started doing posters for Boyd Grafmeyer, who took over from the Helix and Paul Dorpat, which was booking the shows at the Eagles for a very brief period. And then they got somebody who was only doing that. And one of John's influences growing up was Arthur Rackham, the guy who did a lot of the Alice in Wonderland and Treasure Island and illustrations and the late Victorian stuff. And you can really see it here.
Yeah, like all the San Francisco poster artists, John was looking at what had come before in graphic art and illustration, and was searching out all of these roots, which is really, you could spend a lifetime just searching out what Mouse and Kelly had
right
put on the plate.
Yeah, the influences.
Yeah.
And here's another one, another by John. It's somewhat atypical for him. I get this piece mixed up with Jacques Moideret.
Yeah, it's a little odd.
Yeah, it's kind of an odd one. But the Daily Flash, they headlined the Avalon Ballroom a couple of times, I think. Yeah. They were a Seattle band, or what Tacoma? I can't remember.
No, they were a Seattle band, and they went down there early on in '66 and played Family Dog and at the Fillmore.
Yeah.
And they were probably the biggest, well, at that point in time, they were the Seattle band, but Seattle has had so many bands. Biggest band at the time could have been for just a few months, because they came and there was so much new talent coming through Seattle or from Seattle.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you notice here it says Lights by Retina Circus. I don't know if John Mowring had joined Retina Circus as a member of the Light Show, but he also, in addition to doing rock posters, he was for a while also doing the lights.
Yeah, and he was buddies with, I believe his name was Don Carr or Dave Carr.
Yeah.
Who was Wes Wilson's business partner at Contact Printing in the very beginning.
Right.
And that was the connection for Wes Wilson and John Mowring to collaborate on the Retina Circus logo.
Yeah, which I don't have here, but yeah.
It's in the book.
It's in the book, that's right. Here's a couple of pieces John did quite different and probably about a year apart for Donovan.
Yeah.
And one is obviously just the drawing, and the other is getting a little bit more psychedelic.
And it's only psychedelic with the color added to it. I mean, they're both psychedelic pieces, but the first one, if you pictured the first one, which is printed one color on silver paper, it was actually the same way that he would have drawn the second poster in color, but by that time he was getting sets of negatives and positives of film and overlapping them and opaquing out areas, so only certain areas would be exposed to a plate, and it gets into this just a cluster of technicalities of trying to strip all this stuff. And he would actually strip a lot of his own posters, and so he figured out this way to colorize his posters just through stripping negatives.
Right.
And huge leap. But the artwork is really a little bit similar. It's just if you saw the black and white of Donna, which I never have, of the Tales of the Reedy River, it would look quite similar to the other one as far as a line art piece. High contrast photograph and hand lettering, and then probably the setting type was probably because it was used in other places. And so I think this poster was also probably used the Reedy River, probably also in Portland and probably in Vancouver.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because it has that bar at the bottom so that you can, yeah.
The dead giveaway bar.
The dead giveaway bar.
And now they put logos across the bottom, which is even a bigger dead giveaway. Yes.
This one I love, Big Brother. I have to confess, the first time I looked at this, all I could see was a butt, like two legs and two cheeks. And then I finally saw the woman, with her arms outstretched, and
when I saw it in black and white, all of a sudden it became very apparent how he had done this and what the drawing was. But in this pink and blue, I mean, they just vibrate like crazy. And I think this was the first John Moring poster that I saw. And a friend of mine had it who was into the light show thing, and it had a big autograph across it, done in the 80s by Sam Andrew. He was in Seattle at the time and was autographing all kinds of Big Brother memorabilia.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a shame.
Well,
this is it's really hard to read the lettering, and when I interviewed John, he told me that Boyd Grafmeyer was not happy about it because the lettering is just so hard to read. But this is a concert for, of all bands, the Strawberry Alarm Clock.
Yeah, and I can't even remember too many times seeing posters for Strawberry Alarm Clock. I think of them as a kind of a pop 40 band.
Right.
And this has got to be one of the most psychedelic posters that John ever did. And he picked all three colors as if Victor Moscoso had given him a lesson. And yeah, it's hard to look at. And
yeah,
it's beautiful. It doesn't reproduce as well because it doesn't photograph. And the original of this poster is a real gem.
Yeah. And you can see the strawberries in there and stuff. And, but again, it's just, I mean, I love it. It's just so hard to read.
Yeah.
Here's a couple more of, this business where he was coloring both the positive and negatives. Is that right?
Yeah, he would have drawn both of these posters in black and white and just picked one color for the black and one color for the white, and the most opposing colors he could grab, and then whoever printed it would have to register this thing right on, and to not get much overlap.
Right.
And on sheet fed presses that usually just ran one color at a time, there would be all kinds of ways that paper would stretch, and it wasn't always easy. If you had a press that printed more than one color, it was a bit of a much easier job, but John was picking things that were difficult to print and really difficult to look at once they were done. When you see both of these images in black and white, they look very different.
Right.
That's how they would have looked when he drew them and then took them to the printer, and then there would have been no proofs. And when they came off the press, hopefully with fingers crossed, he liked the way they looked, because you usually wouldn't have changed a color on a short print run like this.
Yeah. and knowing the circumstances of how John worked, and the timing, it was probably Boyd Grafmeyer's marketing person was waiting to get the posters to distribute them. I mean, there was no time to spare.
Yeah, and promoters wanted the names of the bands out there, especially if they were bands from out of town. And when things got difficult to read, really increased the popularity of the posters, because people would look at them and try to figure them out, and it became kind of a game. Like, boy, if you knew what this was about, you could figure out what it said. And if you didn't, you probably wouldn't be interested in the Doors anyway.
Right.
And, it was the total allure, and promoters just were coming from a different place.
Right. Towards the end of some of his work for Grafmeyer, John had said that he had never been political, that was kind of Walt Crowley's territory. Yes. But you see, like in '68, you see a lot of anti-war peace imagery. There's I don't have it, it's in the book, but there's a wonderful Phil Oakes poster with these arms around a peace sign and such. And it's kind of like, I think John, had to kind of deal with current events finally at a certain point.
Yeah, and it also may have had some to do with how much time he was given for an image. If he had 2 weeks, that would have been great. He probably would have poured into it for 2 whole weeks. And if he just had 2 days, it may have shown, and he may have used a photograph that was, a promotional piece. And on the Blue Cheer poster, that is obviously an old illustration that he, lifted from somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And then last but definitely not least for the John Moring section is this. And he told me that his regret was not to give the photographer credit, because it's the photo from the back of Reuben and the Jets, I think.
And I'm not so sure that this wasn't a published photograph of Frank from high school.
Oh, it could have been just like a yearbook thing?
Yeah, it definitely was not Frank at the time of Reuben and the Jets.
Right.
And yeah, and I don't even know if there is credit, for that poster, but this was my all-time favorite John Moring poster, which was also used in Portland and Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
But this was the pinnacle of his own technique of stripping negatives together. And when you see this poster in person, it's printed on a odd textured coated stock, and it scuffs easily. But when you look at it up close, it is just beautiful.
Yeah.
And, the type is almost secondary.
He had to do the stripping for all those little triangles with the yellow and the red and the green. And
yeah. So if you wanted for the color pink to show through, pink or red, you would have blocked out everything else and just let those colors show through. But the red would have had to have yellow included with it, and the pink wouldn't. And just keeping this, I'm hoping he could have had these proofed, but I never saw blue line proofs until, I saw early Family Dog or Bill Graham stuff. So I don't know. I never saw a proof of any of these posters.
Right.
So I think when they came off the press, you had to have your fingers crossed that you didn't, strip out something that you wanted or forget to strip out something that you didn't want.
Hey, Scott, I'm getting a text from Glenn saying that, from Glenn Beebe saying that, yes, that is his yearbook photograph.
Aha. I would expect that Glenn would have been able to validate my guess. That's the kind of guy Glenn is. He was getting into the details, and when I wouldn't even think about things like page numbers, he was thinking ahead.
Yeah.
So thanks, Glenn. I appreciate that.
Yeah, we all do. So another accidental artist was, again, by his own admission, was Chuck Trimble.
Yeah.
And Chuck ran the Hub Ballroom. at UW.
Well, that kind of explains a few things too, because he also did posters for the Happening, which became later on the Showbox in Seattle.
Uh-huh.
And there were shows at the Hub Ballroom and at the Happening where they used the same band on the same date, and the bands played both shows.
Mm-hmm.
And we now have posters to authenticate that idea since the book came out. But we found another posters for the Happening that Chuck did for a show with the Daily Flash and Country Joe and the Fish. So
right.
And yeah, this is I believe this was a screen print.
Mm-hmm. And here's one of his Hub Ballroom pieces. And he didn't do the photography. The photo is credited in the book, but everything else was Chuck's work.
Yeah, and I never saw his posters very often. They were really rare to find. The Happening one with Country Joe and the Fish and Daily Flash, I probably saw 5 copies of it at the most in 35 years.
Yeah.
And this one, I think this was the only copy of this I'd ever even seen.
I just noticed that the word retina is misspelled.
There's a lot of that is good. And a lot of people mistake Retina Circus for the Vancouver venue, Retinal Circus,
right,
which also had a series of posters. And a lot of people, I noticed even on Wes Wilson's website, they call his Retina Circus logo a Retinal Circus from Vancouver
right
piece. And there's a lot of, those people were watching each other a lot in Vancouver and Seattle, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Here's another, here's one that Chuck did for Boyd Grafmeyer at Eagles with Steppenwolf.
Yeah, and once again, you can see how proofing could have helped, because the pictures of Steppenwolf just sort of look like black or purple silhouettes.
Right.
And I think if you had seen a proof of that, maybe you would have done something a little differently. I know all of my posters, I never had a proof of anything, and every one of them, you'd always see glaring things that, well, it's a little late now. And that's kind of the fun of some of these things. They're amateurish.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like a folk art thing. And it's kind of welcome, down the road, when now everybody has gotten so slick and so good and everything's impeccable, and you don't see these misspellings. And
yeah.
I had a half a dozen misspellings on my posters that were printed, and probably twice that many before they got printed, that other people would see before they hit the press, and I would ever, be able to change them or not. And
yeah. Here's Chuck's most famous. This one apparently they had to cover the butts when they were put around town or something. They had to censor them.
Yeah, and I didn't see this poster ever until we were making the book. And I think Chuck had the copy of this poster that I think he showed it to Glenn when Glenn was asking him some questions about something. And this was the first I had seen this, and it's my favorite poster. Plus it has the same background as the Jefferson Airplane Trips Festival poster, but this is a way better piece. Yeah, there's some kind of sketchy Mothers pieces that came out of Seattle. And there was one that we included in the book that definitely had gone through the press again, where someone decided to censor it.
Right.
Now, this is pretty funny.
This is a good, yeah. And this brings us to the most recent person I've written about at Collectors Weekly, actually. If it's I put it on the homepage of Collectors Weekly. It's there right now if you want to read it. But this is an artist named Donna Wallace Cohen, who you introduced me to, Scott.
Yeah, and this was something that everybody in Seattle
always wondered who Wallace Studios was, because no one had ever seen any of this artwork on anything else except for the posters. There were never other pieces of graphic art around by Wallace Studios, and the printing didn't look like anything done in Seattle. And I'd always figured it was Bay Area because of Matthew Cates was a Bay Area promoter, but he also had ties in Seattle. And it was a mystery. And everybody wanted to know who Wallace Studio was. Glenn and Art and I talked about this numerous times. And well, you kind of broke the ice when you interviewed her.
Yeah, well, she was, in San Francisco when she was doing posters for the Love Conspiracy Commune of all things. Her name was Donna Herrick, and she did a poster for the Grateful Dead's first show at Winterland, for example. And she did a poster for what was supposed to be a 2-week run of the Doors at the Whiskey A Go-Go, the San Francisco branch of the Whiskey A Go-Go, which reportedly the Doors, they played the first 2 nights and they said, we're out of here. Because it was basically a bar with topless waitresses, and that was kind of the show. And so people weren't there to see Jim Morrison, and so they kind of bailed on it. But yeah, Donna's pretty interesting. And then when Matthew Cates got canned by the Jefferson Airplane, he was their manager, and he was fired by the time Jefferson Airplane Takes Off came out. He sort of decided to take the San Francisco sound stuff somewhere else, and somewhere else was Seattle. And so they did a whole series for about 5 months, from like the fall of '67 to the spring of '68. They did shows up on Capitol Hill. With all bands that Cates managed. Moby Grape, It's a Beautiful Day. That's why It's a Beautiful Day was stuck in Seattle writing Whitebird, waiting to play a show. And so they were all billed as San Francisco Sound.
Right. With really, it should have been the Seattle Sound, but
right.
San Francisco sold.
Yeah, and Donna told me that really a lot of these bands were not even bands in some cases. They were just musicians, and Cates would say, okay, your name is going to be Tripsichord Music Box or whatever. And I don't know that that's exactly what happened in their case or not, but it was that kind of thing. And so he would pull these musicians together, drummer, bass, keyboard, singer, guitar, and just kind of create a band to play at his club.
Yeah, and I've also seen a San Francisco Sound poster for Redding, California from 1967, which would have been the same time for the Moby Grape.
Oh.
I bet pretty much anything that Moby Grape never played Redding, California.
Uh-huh.
But somebody did called Moby Grape, and I'm not so sure that the Moby Grapes that played in Seattle were also the original Moby Grape.
Well, I mean, clearly some of these posters were designed to get people to the venue.
Yeah.
And then whoever was on stage was kind of perhaps a secondary consideration.
And I think they had a poster shop there where she tried to sell posters. And that might be why, for a while, at least in the 80s, there were tons of these San Francisco Sound posters around.
Yeah.
And, the 2 guys I knew that had them had quantities of all of them.
Uh-huh.
And tickets and postcards, and now they're all gone.
Yeah.
It's impossible to find pretty much any of it.
Huh. Here's a couple more.
Yeah.
Towards, to my eye, towards the end of her time doing posters for Cates, the one on the left here is from December, and the one on the right, I can't tell. Oh, also December. Yeah, later in December. Her style got kind of interestingly more formal. She kind of, whereas her her lettering had been kind of maybe more ad hoc, more free flowing. It got kind of not rigid by any extent, but just more organized and better, I think.
Yeah, it's some of them, to me, they're kind of hit and miss. And once again, her choice of colors sometimes really made the posters work, and sometimes I think were kind of a detriment to the design.
Yeah. And here's like a couple of later ones in the early winter, or February, I guess, of '68, where she started framing everything. Everything started getting framed.
Yeah. And also the lettering is getting away from the Art Nouveau Wes Wilson roller typeface.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to remember too, by the end of '67, that typeface had kind of run its course and people were trying to distance themselves from that. And I think she was aware of that.
Yeah, yeah. This one I think is just gorgeous. I love this one. This was her last piece for San Francisco Sound.
Yeah, it's and I'd like to have seen what her work looked like in black and white. That's always, when I saw Wes Wilson's original artwork in black and white, boy, all kinds of things jumped out at me. And it's always the best way to get a real insight to posters is to see the original artwork or a film, and because all these colors were just added to a black and white drawing.
Well, like Gary Eagle, her archive went up in flames. In her case, in the mid '70s in Novato, California, just her house burned down. And so she said, she told me that she at one point had everything, all her original drawings and everything, and it just gone. So
it happened a few times to a few people.
Yeah, yeah. So Scott, I'm going to stop this share, and now it's just us. Hopefully people can still see us or can see us. And let me get my notes here. So you have a couple of copies of the book left, correct?
I have a few. I have maybe a box and a half, so I might have maybe 20 books left.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have maybe a handful of ones that John autographed for me and all the other artists that were at the release party.
Right.
Which I'm saving, but I maybe have a half a dozen of those. But hopefully these will sell out eventually. And my dream would be that some small publisher would come along and love to do a second printing there's a few corrections to be made and a lot more information and a number of posters to add. So we've found a lot of things since the book came out that we would like to include, but at this point, I'm not up for publishing a book again and mailing out 500 copies. So we'll see what happens in the future. I'm not too anxious. I think something will happen if it's meant to happen, and we'll see.
Yeah, yeah. Somebody very early on, somebody asked a question about some of your work for the dead. What was the process? I mean, you did a lot of stuff, all those road trips and the Dave's picks and the Europe '72 stuff. I mean, how did that? What was there a process for that with you?
There was a process, and my web designer, his girlfriend was the secretary for the guy who was running the Grateful Dead at the time in 2000. I think it was 6. And at that time, most of the recordings were kind of going through the Grateful Dead, and she showed him my website, and they asked me to do a poster. And after I did that, I ended up doing maybe 60 CD and LP covers, a few other posters. And in the early days,
they'd come up with ideas, and all their marketing went through Grateful Dead. And now it's sort of been transferred to Rhino Records, and I don't have really much to do with them. So for a handful of years, I did a ton of work for them, probably as much as I'd ever done for any client in my life.
Right.
So,
Right.
And I just did a piece last year, but it's not like it was in 2008, 9, 10.
Mhm.
And there was one right after the next. And I think there were 20 some road trips things, and then the Dave's Picks. And then at Dave's Picks, they said that they kind of wanted to have a different artist for every cover. And the art director designer just flipped, I think, and they could do 4, a year subscription. And that way it wouldn't be a different designer, because every artist and illustrator has their own way of working.
Right.
And for an art director or designer to be able to work with them on a different project every time with a different artist became, pretty hard to accomplish that, at that pace.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And I've did a bunch of work, and some of the stuff that I was really proud of. I like working with art directors, but with the Grateful Dead, there was never really an art director. It was just, here's the date, here's the year, and here's the show and where it was, and have fun.
Uh-huh.
And I often would come up with 2 or 3 designs, and the way I work would be take it way too far and almost to finished art on each one, so that they knew exactly what I wanted to do. And it was always a big hindrance for everybody saying, no, I don't want to see all that. And I would just do it anyway. And I still do that to this day. Someone asks me for a sketch, and I'll say, give me a week.
So the lesson you learned from Wilkins Peterson, it didn't stick with you.
No, it hasn't. And I wish it had, but to this day, people say, oh, just do something rough. And it's not in me.
Uh-huh.
It probably has to do with airbrushing for 30 years and cutting frisket and measuring everything by the thickness of an X-Acto blade. And
Right.
if you saw an X-Acto blade, an art director thickness in a line, they wouldn't want it. You had to repair that. So it was a little bit anal.
Uh-huh. And what are you working on these days, Scott?
Not much, mostly landscaping and hiking and surfing. But I am right now working on a design for a Seattle restaurant up in Loyal Heights, North Ballard.
Mm-hmm.
And it is for a restaurant who the owner is a Grateful Dead fan.
Okay.
So he could see me fitting into a design for him. And plus he has a great restaurant. It's been there for about a decade, and trying to drum up a little business with some artwork. So we'll do t-shirts and I don't know what else.
Okay, well, we'll look for that. We'll check. You have a lot of I think I saw like a lot of the original art for some of the road trips and such.
Yes, and while being an artist, I sold everything. I wanted to save. You want to save everything for a show or something, but I never could. So I sold everything pretty much as I did it. And a lot of it went to a collector in Portland who passed away, and his widow sent 40 pieces back to me saying, hey, could you sell these? And I said, well, maybe. And I'm going to get around to it. Maybe, I got them back last summer. So now they're hanging on this wall, or some of them. And I'll get to that in a little while, in winter when it's raining and I'm stuck indoors all the time and not painting.
Hey, Scott, we have a question from Mark Arminsky, and
oh, great.
He says, I wasn't aware that most of your work was offset. I know there are 2 different animals, but do you have a preference between offset and screen printing?
Well, I think it would depend on who the printers were. If I could work with someone like Gary Houston on every screen print, I'd be pretty tempted to just do screen printing. And the problem with offset is that it requires you do so much, a bigger run. And I would always want to be at the press and split fountain at least 1 or 2 plates. And it really depends on who I was working with. I had a printer in Seattle up in Greenwood that I just loved to work with and would allow me to come in and stick my nose in there when they were printing. And a lot of printers didn't want some artist hanging around telling them what to do or suggesting what to do. Probably afraid they get their fingers stuck in their ink rollers or something. But I really haven't had much screen printing experience where I was involved directly. In junior high, that was 1 and 2 color stuff, and that was simple. And then by the time I was working with Gary, he was suggesting things that I wasn't aware of. And I have way more experience in offset lithography than screen printing, but I'd love to do more screen printed work. Small runs, that's really a much more interesting avenue now than doing the big runs of when you were working with advertising. And most of the advertising I was working with, I was never around for the printing because I was never even signed anything.
Yeah.
To the ad agency, and I never saw it again unless it was in a publication or a billboard or a TV ad.
Right. But you still work starting with pencil or something in your hand.
Yeah, and I never made the digital leap. So I'm a dinosaur. So I have to hire someone after I have a black and white pen and ink drawing, which is usually what I call my original art, if it's not a painting. And these days I probably would do everything in that process. And I would get someone like a digital guy like Glenn Beebe or Steve Vance, and that understood what I wanted to do, which is usually make it look like it was printed in 1967. And I go to great lengths to make things look a little bit crude, not as far as to go to out of registration, but I'd consider that too. So this day and age, it involves not only me, but someone else, a production person.
Yeah.
And I don't have enough work volume to justify learning a computer to the point where I would do my own color work.
Right.
Nor am I even interested in it.
Right.
Other people can learn all that stuff, and they understand, when you tell them what you want, if they've seen your work before, it's pretty simple.
Right.
My demands are simple. I like to make things look uncomplicated and uncomputerized. So I like to make them look like they were designed a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Scott, what were you going to say?
I said, I'm still stuck.
You're still stuck.
But I like it.
Yeah. Well, I for one, am glad you're stuck. I really appreciate you speaking with us today about your work and the work that you've admired in Seattle. And seriously, if you haven't seen this book, you really owe it to yourself. If you love rock posters, there's just this whole world in Seattle that you may not be completely aware of. And I just want to remind people that it's never too late to become a member of TRPS. So I'm going to give one more plug for that. Just go to trips.org. There's a button, there's a link at the top of every page that says membership, and just click it, and it's pretty painless. Thank you, Scott. We'll hope to do this again real soon. Hopefully we'll have another one in December. And I guess we'll be seeing you.
Thank you for so much. And this was really fun. I really enjoyed, what more can you have, talking about yourself? It's good to talk to you, Ben.
Nice to see you again, Scott.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.